Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so haunting, that it left you questioning the very fabric of reality? I'm Caspian Blackwood, an architect who has spent years restoring old, forgotten buildings. But what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story of bricks and mortar. It's a story that began with a dream so terrifying, it blurred the lines between the waking world and the darkest corners of my mind. Before we dive into the depths of this unsettling tale, I need you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a thumbs up, because the stories I bring to you are not just meant to entertain. They are meant to challenge your courage and take you to places where the shadows have a life of their own. It started on a night like any other, or so I thought. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself in a place that was both unfamiliar and deeply unnerving. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I stood before the gates of an abandoned psychiatric asylum, its towering walls looming over me like the gravestones of forgotten souls. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense fog that clung to the ground, and the silence was so profound it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. But this was no ordinary silence. There was a heaviness to it, a weight that bore down on me, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the cold, damp stone beneath my feet, and the scent of decay filled my nostrils, mixing with something metallic, like the faint, lingering scent of blood. It was as if the very walls of the asylum had absorbed the terror of those who had once been confined within. And now, that terror was seeping out, reaching for me. As I stood there, frozen in place, a low rhythmic sound began to echo through the fog. Thud, 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 like the distant methodical beating of a massive unseen heart. The sound reverberated through my chest, matching the increasingly frantic rhythm of my own heartbeat. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt as if they were rooted to the ground, held in place by some invisible force. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at one of the windows high above, staring down at me, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. It was only a fleeting glimpse, but in that brief moment, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, as if the figure had reached into my soul and touched the very core of my fears. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the sense of being watched, of being hunted, remained. Before I could gather my thoughts, the gates creaked open, the rusted metal groaning in protest, as if the asylum itself was reluctantly allowing me entry. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself walking forward, drawn into the darkness, as if compelled by a force I couldn't understand. The fog swallowed me whole as I stepped across the threshold, and the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving me alone in the shadow of the asylum. What I didn't realize then was that this was just the beginning. This was no ordinary dream. It was the first step into a nightmare that would soon become all too real. So, before we continue, I urge you to stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear might just blur the lines between your own dreams and reality. And if you think you can handle it, hit that subscribe button, because the stories that follow will take you even deeper into the unknown. It was an ordinary night, or so it seemed, when the dream first began. I had just finished a long day of work and collapsed into bed, eager for sleep to take me. But as soon as my eyes closed, I found myself in a place that was both alien and eerily familiar, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The dream took me to an abandoned psychiatric asylum, a place I had never seen before. Yet it felt like I had walked these grounds in another time, another life perhaps. The asylum stood like a sentinel of despair, its towering structure wrapped in a shroud of fog so thick that it swallowed the light of the moon, casting everything in shades of gray. The building was a monolith of forgotten suffering, with ivy choking its walls and shattered windows that seemed like the hollow eyes of a dead giant. As I approached, a feeling of unease gnawed at me, as if the very ground beneath my feet was cursed, soaked in the misery of those who had once been trapped within. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, each breath I took becoming visible, as if the asylum itself exhaled the chill of the grave. A putrid stench assaulted my senses, a foul mix of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something metallic and acrid, like the lingering scent of blood long dried but never forgotten. It clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe, and I could almost taste the despair that saturated the air. The silence was oppressive, a silence that wasn't merely the absence of sound, but rather a heavy, crushing force that pressed down on me from all sides. And yet, within that silence, there was something else. A low, barely perceptible hum, like the distant murmur of voices echoing through the decaying halls. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets long buried, secrets they wanted me to uncover. As I crossed the threshold into the asylum, I was immediately enveloped in darkness. The kind of darkness that feels alive, moving, shifting just out of sight. My footsteps echoed in the vast, empty corridor, the sound unnervingly loud, as if I was intruding upon a sacred, forbidden place. The walls seemed to close in on me, the narrow passageways winding like a labyrinth designed to trap me within its nightmarish embrace. The air was thick with a suffocating weight, and as I walked, I became acutely aware of a strange sensation beneath my feet. The floor felt uneven, almost soft in places, like I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. With each step, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift beneath them, as if the very building resented my presence. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the ticking of a clock, but far more sinister. Tap, tap, tap. It came from somewhere deep within the asylum, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was drawing closer, and with it a growing sense of dread. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound merging with the ominous tapping, creating a dreadful symphony that filled the dark corridors. As I rounded a corner, the tapping abruptly stopped, plunging me into a silence so absolute that it was deafening. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, straining to hear anything that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing, only the dark, endless corridor stretching out before me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, quick and elusive, darting across the far end of the corridor. It was gone before I could fully register it, but the sight sent a jolt of terror through me. I was not alone. Something was here with me, something that didn't belong in this world. With trembling hands, I reached out to the wall beside me, feeling the cold, rough texture of the decaying plaster beneath my fingertips. The sensation was strangely comforting, a tether to reality, in a place that seemed determined to unmoor me from it. But even as I clung to that small comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. As I ventured further, I began to notice small details that should not have been there. Objects out of place, as if someone or something had been moving them. A chair that had been facing one direction was now turned towards the wall. A door that had been closed was now ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. The shadows seemed to writhe with a life of their own, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. And then the smell hit me, a sickly, sweet odor that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of decay, of something that had been rotting in the dark for far too long. I followed the scent, drawn deeper into the heart of the asylum, until I reached a room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly open, a faint, unnatural light seeping through the crack. My hand shook as I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside froze me to the core. In the center of the room was a single, decrepit bed, its metal frame rusted and bent, the mattress stained with what could only be old blood, and sitting on the bed, illuminated by the faint glow of a flickering light bulb, was a figure, small, frail, and hunched over, with its back to me. It was dressed in a tattered hospital gown, its skin pale and almost translucent, like wax. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare. but something held me in place, some terrible curiosity that compelled me to see more. As I approached, the figure slowly began to turn, and I saw its face, or rather, the void where its face should have been. It was a blank, featureless expanse, smooth and pale, with nothing but two hollow indentations where the eyes should have been. My scream caught in my throat, a strangled gasp escaping instead as the figure began to rise from the bed, its movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, and a terrible, hollow sound echoed through the room, like a low moan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as the figure took a step towards me, its faceless head tilted as if it was studying me, sensing my fear. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart nearly stop, it lunged at me, moving with a speed that defied its frail appearance. Everything went black. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the terror of the dream still clinging to me like a shroud. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the curtains. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but the feeling of dread, of something watching me, hadn't left. It lingered in the air, as if the dream had followed me into the waking world. And then I heard it again, the faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. The dream was only the beginning. As I struggled to shake off the lingering terror of the dream, I couldn't ignore the eerie sense of familiarity that clung to me like a second skin. The dream felt more like a memory, a dark echo of something I had forgotten, or perhaps something that had been deliberately buried deep within my mind. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the details gnawed at me, refusing to fade into the recesses of my subconscious. The following night, sleep came with a sense of dread, as if I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, knowing that I would fall back into that place, that nightmare. And I did. I found myself once again standing in the cold, decaying corridors of the asylum. The atmosphere was even more oppressive this time, as if the very walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with their dark history. The air was thick with the same metallic stench, only now it was stronger, almost choking. The shadows that filled the asylum seemed to move with a life of their own, writhing and shifting just beyond the reach of the dim light that flickered overhead. Each step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into a void, with no hope of escape. As I walked down the long, narrow hallway, the sense of being watched grew more intense, as if unseen eyes were following my every move. I could feel them, boring into the back of my skull, whispering sinister secrets just out of earshot. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if they were alive, breathing with a life force that fed on fear. The floor beneath me creaked ominously, and with each step, it felt as though the asylum itself was resisting, trying to push me away, yet drawing me in at the same time. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when I noticed the objects around me. At first, they were subtle changes. A chair that had been in one corner was now in the center of the room, facing the opposite direction. A dusty, cracked mirror that had been hanging on the wall was now on the floor, shards of glass scattered around it like a broken promise. The door to one of the rooms, which I distinctly remembered being locked, was now slightly ajar, as if inviting me to enter. But it was the shadows that disturbed me the most. They didn't behave as shadows should. They moved independently, stretching and contorting in unnatural ways, defying the laws of light and darkness. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, creeping along the walls, slithering across the floor, and reaching out for me with long, twisted fingers. I could hear them whispering, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves, but the words were indistinct, maddeningly elusive. As I continued to explore, the sense of dread became almost unbearable. The asylum was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and hidden rooms, each one more decrepit and foreboding than the last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old buildings settling, or perhaps something else moving in the darkness. The further I went, the more I felt the weight of the place bearing down on me, as if the very walls were pressing in, suffocating me with their grim history. Then, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. As I rounded a corner, I caught sight of a figure at the end of the hallway. It was only there for a moment, a fleeting shadow that disappeared almost as soon as I saw it. But it was enough to send my heart racing. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure appeared again as I approached the end of the corridor, this time standing in a doorway, its back turned to me. It was dressed in a long, dark coat, the collar pulled up high, obscuring its face. But even from behind, I could sense the malice emanating from it. A dark, oppressive energy that made my skin crawl. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as the figure slowly turned its head towards me. But before I could see its face, it vanished, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. I was left standing alone in the empty corridor, my heart pounding in my chest, the silence around me now thick with the sense of impending doom. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to flee this place, and never return. But something inside me, a twisted sense of curiosity perhaps, pushed me forward. I couldn't leave now, not when I was so close to uncovering whatever dark secret the asylum was hiding. I continued down the corridor, my steps slow and cautious, the fear gnawing at me like a ravenous beast. The air grew colder, and the silence was so deep that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I reached the door where the figure had been standing and, with a trembling hand, pushed it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb that hung from the ceiling by a frayed wire. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with age and neglect, and the floor was littered with debris. Broken furniture, tattered clothing, and old, yellowed papers scattered like the remnants of forgotten lives. But it was the door at the far end of the room that drew my attention. It was slightly ajar, just as it had been in the dream, and from within a faint light emanated, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. My heart pounded as I approached, the sense of dread now so intense that it was almost suffocating. I reached for the door, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. What I saw inside froze me in place. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and in the center stood an old, decrepit wheelchair. It was the same one from my dream, the rusted metal frame twisted and bent, the fabric of the seat and backrest torn and stained. But it wasn't the wheelchair that filled me with terror. It was the figure sitting in it. It was the same figure I had seen in the hallway, only now I could see its face, or rather the lack of it. The face was a blank, featureless void, smooth and pale, with no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank canvas of skin that seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was trying to break free from beneath the surface. The figure's head tilted towards me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and malevolent. A low guttural sound emanated from its throat, a sound that sent shivers down my spine and made my blood run cold. It was a sound of pure malice, of something that was neither human nor animal, something ancient and evil. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the figure began to rise from the wheelchair, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The air around me grew colder, the shadows deepening, closing in on me from all sides. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, the figure lunged at me, its featureless face twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. Everything went black as I was engulfed in darkness, the cold, suffocating void swallowing me whole. I awoke in my bed, gasping for air, my heart racing, the terror of the dream still clinging to me like a shroud. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but the fear, the dread, the sense of being watched, it was all too real. And then, in the silence of the night, I heard it again, the faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. The dream wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it was that haunted the asylum, it wasn't done with me yet. The dream, or rather the nightmare, had become a nightly torment. Every time I closed my eyes, I was pulled back into the decaying asylum, each visit more terrifying than the last. It was as if the place had latched onto my mind, refusing to let go, dragging me deeper into its suffocating darkness. But on the fourth night, everything changed. The dream took a turn, one so horrifying that it blurred the line between nightmare and reality, leaving me questioning my sanity. As usual, I found myself standing in the shadow of the asylum, the cold, clammy fog wrapping around me like a shroud. The silence was even more oppressive this time, thick and stifling, as if the air itself had weight. But something was different. There was a palpable tension in the atmosphere, a sense of anticipation, as if the asylum was waiting for me, eager for what was to come. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The corridor stretched out before me, the walls covered in peeling, moldy wallpaper, and the floor creaking ominously underfoot. The shadows seemed to gather around me, shifting and coiling like living things, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. But there was something else, something new. A faint, rhythmic thudding sound, like the distant beating of a massive heart echoing through the corridors. As I followed the sound, it grew louder, more insistent, each beat reverberating through my chest, matching the frantic rhythm of my own heartbeat. The wall seemed to close in around me, the corridor narrowing until I could barely squeeze through. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath in the dim light. Every step felt like I was wading through something viscous and unseen, something that resisted my every move. And then I saw it, the source of the sound. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, with a faint, eerie light seeping through the crack. The thudding sound was coming from within, growing louder with each passing second, as if whatever was behind that door was growing impatient, waiting for me to open it. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the cold metal handle biting into my palm. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and it was empty, except for a single decrepit wheelchair sitting in the center. Its metal frame rusted and bent. The fabric of the seat and backrest stained with something dark and foul. The light bulb overhead flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. But it was the object on the seat of the wheelchair that drew my attention, freezing me in place. It was a doll, old and tattered, with a cracked porcelain face and empty, staring eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. Its clothes were torn and filthy, and one of its arms hung limply by its side as if it had been broken. But the most disturbing thing was the fact that it looked eerily familiar, almost like a twisted miniature version of myself. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling. As soon as I made contact, the thudding sound stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room deepened, swirling around me like a dark vortex. Suddenly, the doll's head snapped up, its empty eyes locking onto mine. A twisted smile spread across its cracked face, and it began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it stood up from the wheelchair. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the doll started to walk towards me, its movement stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the doll came closer, its smile widening into a grotesque grin. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, closing in around me, suffocating me. And then, in a voice that was both childlike and deeply unsettling, the doll spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind like a twisted nursery rhyme. "Now you're trapped, just like the others." The room began to spin, the walls warping and twisting as the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. The doll's laughter filled the air, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to run, to flee from this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, helpless as the darkness closed in around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The room was still, the shadows gone, the doll and the wheelchair nowhere to be seen. I was alone, standing in the middle of an empty room, the light bulb overhead flickering weakly. But something was wrong. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and I could feel a presence behind me, something dark and malevolent. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the corner of the room, stood the figure from my previous dreams. The same featureless, faceless entity that had haunted me night after night. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a shadowy figure in the distance. It was right in front of me, its head tilted to one side, as if studying me. Its blank face somehow conveying a sense of deep, twisted satisfaction. The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed towards the door. The message was clear. I had been warned. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. As I turned to leave, I noticed something etched into the wall beside the door, an intricate symbol, one that I had seen before, though I couldn't quite place where. It was the same symbol that had appeared in my earlier dreams, the same one that seemed to follow me, haunting me even in the waking world. With trembling hands, I traced the symbol with my fingers, feeling a strange, almost electric sensation as I did. The moment I touched it, a searing pain shot through my head, blinding me with its intensity. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the room around me dissolved into darkness. When I finally regained consciousness, I was lying in my own bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the remnants of the nightmare still vivid in my mind. But something was different this time. Something had followed me out of the dream. Something dark and insidious that now lingered in the corners of my vision, just out of sight. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, the faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the darkness of my room. Tap, tap, tap. I turned on the light, but nothing was there. The room was empty, just as it should be, but the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. And then I saw it, a shadow moving across the wall, not cast by any object in the room. It was the same figure from the asylum, the same faceless entity that had haunted me in my dreams. But now it was here, in my waking world, and it wasn't going to let me go. The nightmare had become reality, and I was trapped, just as the doll had warned. The asylum had followed me, its darkness now a part of my life, a shadow that would never leave. I knew then that there was no escape. The asylum had claimed me, body and soul, and it would continue to haunt me, to torment me, until there was nothing left. And as I lay there, paralyzed by fear, the figure moved closer, its blank face looming over me, its presence overwhelming. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was its voice, whispering in my ear, "Welcome home." Everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in my bed, but the sense of dread, the knowledge that I was no longer alone, remained. The asylum had reached out, crossed the boundary between dreams and reality, and now it was with me, always. I could feel it in the air, in the shadows, in the silence that followed me wherever I went. The nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. The nightmare had bled into reality, and I was no longer certain where one ended and the other began. Days passed in a haze of unease, my mind constantly replaying the events of the dream as I tried to piece together what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was not just a figment of my imagination. There was something real, something malevolent, that had followed me from the asylum and was now lurking in the shadows of my waking life. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I began researching the asylum. I needed to know if there was any truth to the horrors I had experienced, if there was some connection between the place in my dreams and the reality I now faced. My search led me down a rabbit hole of old newspaper clippings, obscure historical records, and half-forgotten local legends, each one more disturbing than the last. What I found shook me to my core. The asylum was not just a product of my imagination. It was a real place, one that had stood in the outskirts of a forgotten town, hidden away from the world for decades. The history of the asylum was steeped in darkness, a place where unspeakable experiments had been conducted on the mentally ill, all in the name of science. The patients, many of whom were committed against their will, were subjected to horrific treatments, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other brutal procedures that left the broken in mind and body. But there was something more, something even more sinister that the records only hinted at. There were rumors of secret experiments conducted in the dead of night, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. Patients who were never registered, who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. The doctors who ran the asylum were said to be obsessed with the occult, conducting rituals and ceremonies that blurred the line between science and the supernatural. As I delved deeper into the asylum's dark past, I discovered that it had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances. The staff had left, suddenly, without explanation, and the patients who remained were left to die, their bodies never recovered. The asylum was sealed off, its existence almost erased from history, as if those in power wanted to bury the horrors that had taken place within its walls. But the most disturbing discovery was the fact that the asylum had been plagued by reports of paranormal activity long before it was abandoned. Patients and staff alike had reported seeing shadowy figures, hearing disembodied voices, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they were alone. Some claimed that the asylum itself was alive, feeding off the fear and suffering of those trapped within its walls. The more I read, the more I realized that my dreams were not just nightmares. They were memories, echoes of the horrors that had taken place in that cursed place. And as I pieced together the fragments of the past, I began to see a pattern, one that connected the asylum to the present day. There were reports of people who had gone missing near the site of the asylum, their bodies never found. Locals spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, of lights seen in the abandoned building at night, of voices that called out from the darkness. The more I dug, the more I realized that the asylum's influence had never truly ended. It had simply lain dormant, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. But it wasn't just the past that was haunting me. It was something much closer to home. The symbol that had appeared in my dreams, the same one etched into the walls of the asylum, began to show up in my waking life. I found it scratched into the wood of my bedroom door, scrawled on the pages of my journal, even drawn in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. It was as if the asylum was reaching out, reminding me that I was not free from its grasp. And then there were the sounds, the faint, rhythmic tapping that had followed me from the dream. It would start up in the dead of night, always at 3:33 a.m., echoing through my apartment, growing louder until it was deafening. I searched every corner of my home, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. No pipes, no dripping faucets, nothing that could explain the noise. It was as if the asylum itself was inside my walls, its heartbeat pounding in time with my own. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to the locals, hoping to find someone who could help me understand what was happening. That's when I met Evelyn, an elderly woman who had lived in the town all her life. She was one of the few who remembered the asylum, who had seen it in its final days, before it was sealed off from the world. Evelyn was reluctant to speak at first, but as I told her about my dreams, about the symbol and the sounds that haunted me, her expression changed from one of caution to one of grim recognition. She invited me into her home, a small cluttered cottage on the outskirts of town, and there, in the dim light of her living room, she told me the story that had been passed down through the generations. The asylum, she said, was built on cursed land, a place where dark rituals had been performed long before the building ever stood. The doctors who ran the asylum had been drawn to the place, sensing its power, and had used it to fuel their own twisted experiments. But their actions had awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that had been dormant for centuries. The symbol, she explained, was a mark of protection, a ward against the darkness that had taken root in the asylum. But it was also a beacon, a way for the spirits trapped within the walls to reach out to the living, to draw them into the nightmare that had consumed them. Those who bore the mark were marked for death, doomed to relive the horrors of the asylum until they were driven mad or worse. As Evelyn spoke, I felt a cold dread settle over me. The asylum had chosen me, just as it had chosen others before me, and there was no escape. The dreams, the symbols, the sounds, they were all signs that the asylum was trying to pull me back, to claim me as one of its own. But there was more. Evelyn told me that the only way to break the curse, to free myself from the asylum's grasp, was to return to the place where it all began. I had to go back to the asylum, to confront the darkness that lurked within its walls, and to destroy the source of its power. It was a choice I never wanted to make, a journey into the heart of darkness that I knew could cost me my life, but I had no other option. The asylum had already taken hold of my mind, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely. So, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with dread, I prepared myself for the journey back to the asylum. I knew that what awaited me there was beyond anything I could imagine, a nightmare that would push me to the very edge of sanity. But if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to break free from the curse, I had to face it head on. The asylum was calling me, and I knew that this time there would be no waking up. The nightmare was real, and it was waiting for me. The decision to return to the asylum weighed heavily on my mind, a dark cloud of dread that followed me everywhere. The journey ahead felt like walking into the mouth of madness itself, but I knew there was no turning back. The asylum had already invaded my life, its darkness seeping into every corner of my existence, and if I didn't confront it, I feared it would consume me completely. The day I set out, the world outside seemed to reflect the turmoil within me. The sky was an oppressive gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what was to come. The drive to the outskirts of the forgotten town felt endless, each passing mile pulling me deeper into a sense of impending doom. The road wound through dense, foreboding woods, the trees gnarled and twisted, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to snare me. As I approached the site, the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. The asylum loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the bleak sky. The building was even more imposing in reality than it had been in my dreams, its decaying walls standing as a testament to the horrors that had taken place within. The windows were blackened, like the hollow eyes of a skull, and the overgrown vegetation around the structure seemed to strangle it, as if nature itself was trying to erase the asylum from existence. I parked my car at the edge of the grounds, the engine cutting off with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. The silence that followed was absolute, a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed down on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the asylum's dark history in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the fear and suffering of those who had been trapped here. As I walked towards the entrance, the memories of my dreams flooded back with startling clarity. Every step felt familiar, yet wrong, as if I was walking in the footsteps of the dead. The ground beneath my feet was soft and uneven, like I was treading on something that had been buried just beneath the surface. The cold, metallic scent of decay filled the air, and I could almost taste the fear that lingered in the shadows. The front door, once a barrier between the outside world and the horrors within, now hung loosely on its hinges, creaking with every gust of wind. I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty corridors like a mournful wail. Stepping inside, I was immediately enveloped in darkness, the dim light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. The air inside was stale and thick, laden with dust and the scent of mold, as if the asylum had been sealed in time, untouched for decades. But I knew better. This place was far from abandoned. As I ventured deeper into the asylum, the sense of being watched grew stronger, an oppressive weight that settled on my shoulders. The walls seemed to close in around me, the narrow corridors twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, as if the building itself was alive, shifting to trap me within its labyrinthine bowels. The shadows danced and writhed at the edges of my vision, and the faint whispers that had haunted my dreams now echoed through the halls, their words just out of reach, maddeningly elusive. The deeper I went, the more the line between dream and reality blurred. The asylum was exactly as it had been in my nightmares, every detail eerily accurate. The same flickering lights, the same decaying walls, the same sense of dread that hung in the air like a heavy fog. But now, the terror was real, the danger tangible. Suddenly I heard it, the faint rhythmic tapping that had haunted my nights, now echoing through the corridors, growing louder with each step I took. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from somewhere deep within the asylum, drawing me closer like a moth to a flame. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound merging with the tapping, creating a dreadful symphony that filled the darkness. As I followed the sound, I felt the temperature drop, the air around me growing colder with each passing moment. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the thick shadows. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it was getting impatient, eager for me to find it. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. I found myself standing at the entrance to a large, open room, the center of which was dominated by a massive rusted metal operating table. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. The walls of the room were lined with old, decaying medical equipment, the remnants of the asylum's dark past. But it was the figure standing beside the table that truly terrified me. It was the same faceless entity that had haunted my dreams, now more real and menacing than ever. Its featureless head was tilted towards me, as if it was studying me, deciding what to do with me. The air around it seemed to ripple with a dark energy, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it, a cold, suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension in the air so thick that I could almost taste it. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, reaching into the darkest corners of my mind, pulling out my deepest fears. And then, it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves, echoing in the darkness. "You've come too far," it said, the words sending shivers down my spine. "There's no turning back now." The figure began to move, its movements slow and deliberate, as it circled the operating table. The darkness around it seemed to pulse and writhe, as if it was alive, feeding off the fear that gripped my heart. "You think you can escape," it whispered, the words dripping with malice. "But this place has claimed you. You belong to the asylum now." My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding as I tried to comprehend what was happening. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible, but my body refused to obey, frozen in place by a terror so profound that it left me paralyzed. The figure moved closer, the darkness following it like a shroud. "There's only one way out," it said, its voice a low hiss. "You must confront the darkness within, but be warned. If you fail, your soul will be lost to this place, just like all the others." It pointed to the far corner of the room, where an old, dusty book lay on a pedestal. The cover was worn and faded, but the symbol etched into its surface was unmistakable. The same symbol that had haunted my dreams, the same one that had appeared in my home, marking me as the asylum's next victim. "This is the source of its power," the figure said, its voice now a low growl. "The book holds the key to breaking the curse, but it also holds the darkness that binds this place together. If you read it, you risk being consumed by the very evil you seek to destroy." I knew then that this was the choice Evelyn had warned me about, the choice that would determine my fate. The asylum had drawn me here, forced me to confront the darkness that had taken root in my soul. But to escape, to break free from its grasp, I would have to risk everything. With trembling hands, I reached for the book, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment my fingers touched its cover, a searing pain shot through my head, blinding me with its intensity. The room around me seemed to dissolve into darkness, the figure's voice echoing in my mind, urging me to open the book, to read the words that would either save me or doom me forever. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a crushing force. I could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent presence of the asylum growing stronger with each passing second. But I knew there was no other choice. With a deep breath, I opened the book, my eyes scanning the ancient, faded text. The words seemed to writhe on the page, twisting and shifting as if they were alive, their meaning just out of reach. But as I read, the pain in my head intensified, the darkness around me growing thicker, more oppressive. And then the figure was upon me, its featureless face inches from my own, its cold, dead hands gripping my shoulders, pulling me into the darkness. "You've made your choice," it whispered, its voice a hiss of triumph. "Now you must face the consequences." The world around me dissolved into chaos, the shadows consuming everything in their path. The pain in my head became unbearable, a searing white-hot agony that threatened to tear me apart. But even as I felt myself slipping away, I held on to the words, the ancient incantation that would either save me or condemn me. And then, with a final blinding flash of light, everything went silent. I awoke in the asylum, the cold, decaying walls around me, the rusted operating table, now empty. The figure was gone, the darkness lifted, but the weight of what I had done, of the choice I had made, lingered in the air. The book lay open on the floor beside me, its pages blank, the symbol now etched into my mind, a permanent reminder of the nightmare I had endured. I had survived, but at what cost? The asylum had released me, but its darkness had left its mark on my soul. I could feel it, a cold, hollow void that would never be filled, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. As I stumbled out of the asylum, the sunlight blinding after the darkness, I knew that I had changed. The world outside felt different, distant, as if I was seeing it through a veil. The nightmare had ended, but the terror, the fear, the darkness, it would always be with me. I had confronted the asylum, but in doing so, I had become a part of it, forever bound to the darkness that lurked within its walls. And as I walked away from the asylum, its shadow looming behind me, I knew that I would never truly be free. The nightmare would continue, in my dreams, in my waking life, a constant reminder that some places are never meant to be disturbed. The asylum had claimed me, and though I had escaped its walls, I would never escape its grasp. The asylum's darkness had left its mark on me, a stain that no amount of light could wash away. Even after escaping its twisted halls, I could still feel its presence, like a shadow that clung to me, haunting every corner of my mind. The days that followed my return from that cursed place were a blur, filled with a lingering sense of dread that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. But deep down, I knew that the asylum wasn't done with me. Not yet. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. Objects in my home started moving on their own. Subtle shifts that I might have overlooked if I hadn't been so attuned to the darkness that now followed me. A chair would be slightly out of place. A door that I had left closed would be open just a crack. And the tapping, the same rhythmic tapping that had haunted me in the asylum, would echo through the halls of my apartment late at night, growing louder with each passing day. But it wasn't just the tapping that unnerved me. There was something else, something far more sinister. I started seeing things, fleeting shadows that darted out of the corner of my eye, strange symbols appearing on the walls and mirrors. The same symbol that had been etched into the book in the asylum. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of decay, as if the very atmosphere had been tainted by the darkness I had brought back with me. And then came the dreams. Visions of the asylum, twisted and distorted, each one more terrifying than the last. The faceless figure that had haunted me before was now a constant presence, lurking in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. In these dreams, I was back in the asylum, but it was different this time. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, as if the building itself was alive, shifting to trap me within its endless maze. But the worst part was the feeling that I was not alone. In every dream, I could sense the presence of others, souls that had been trapped in the asylum long before me, their fear and despair now woven into the very fabric of the place. I could hear their whispers, feel their cold, clammy hands reaching out for me, begging for release. But there was nothing I could do for them. I was just as trapped as they were, a prisoner of the darkness that had claimed me. It wasn't long before the dreams began to bleed into reality. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echoes of the asylum still ringing in my ears. The room around me would seem wrong, distorted, as if I was still trapped in the nightmare, unable to escape. The shadows on the walls would twist and writhe, forming the same symbols that haunted my dreams, and the faceless figure would stand at the foot of my bed, watching me with its empty, soulless gaze. Each day, I felt myself slipping further and further away from reality, my mind fraying at the edges as the darkness tightened its grip on me. The line between dream and waking life blurred, and I began to question what was real and what was merely a figment of my imagination. But there was one thing I knew for certain: the asylum was calling me back. I fought against it, tried to resist the pull of the darkness, but it was no use. The more I tried to escape, the stronger its grip became, until I could no longer tell where the asylum ended and I began. It was as if the place had become a part of me, its darkness now entwined with my soul, and no matter how far I ran, I could never outrun it. It was on the 7th night after my return that everything came to a head. The dreams had been particularly vivid that night, filled with the screams of the damned and the cold, suffocating presence of the faceless figure. I woke up just after midnight, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the tapping echoing through my apartment, louder than ever before. But this time, there was something different. The tapping wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from the floor, directly beneath my bed. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening roar. I could feel the vibrations through the mattress, as if something was trying to break through from below, something dark and malevolent. Slowly I climbed out of bed, my heart racing, and knelt on the floor, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The tapping was so loud now that it felt like it was inside my head, a relentless, maddening rhythm that threatened to drive me insane. I reached out with trembling hands and began to pull at the floorboards, the old, rotting wood splintering under my fingers. As I pried the boards loose, the tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the room into a heavy silence that was almost worse than the noise. I hesitated, my hands trembling, but I knew that I had to see what was beneath the floor. With a final deep breath, I pulled up the last board, revealing a dark, gaping hole that seemed to stretch on forever. The stench that rose from the hole was overpowering, a nauseating mix of decay and something far worse, something that made my stomach turn and my vision blur. But what truly terrified me was the object that lay at the bottom of the hole, a book, old and worn, its cover marked with the same symbol that had haunted me for so long. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. The book from the asylum, the one I had opened to break the curse, was now here, in my home. But how? I had left it behind, or at least I thought I had, yet here it was, a physical manifestation of the nightmare that had consumed me. With trembling hands, I reached down and picked up the book, the cold, rough texture of the cover sending shivers down my spine. As soon as I touched it, the room around me seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. I could feel the darkness pressing down on me, suffocating me, as the faceless figure appeared in the doorway, its presence filling the room with a cold, malevolent energy. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl that echoed in my mind. "You belong to the asylum now." The room began to spin, the darkness swallowing everything in its path, until all that was left was me, the book, and the figure, standing over me, its blank face inches from my own. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, smell the stench of decay that clung to it as it reached out a hand and placed it on the book. In that moment, I felt something break inside me, a deep, primal fear that I had never known before. The book began to pulse with a dark energy, the symbol on the cover glowing with a sickly green light. I tried to pull away, to drop the book, but my hands wouldn't obey. The darkness had taken hold, and there was no escape. The figure leaned in closer, its voice a whisper in my ear. "You made your choice," it said, the words dripping with malice. "Now, you must face the consequences." The room dissolved into darkness, the walls crumbling away until there was nothing left but the void, an endless empty expanse of black. I was alone, suspended in the darkness, the book still clutched in my hands, its energy pulsing through me, consuming me from the inside out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The darkness receded, the walls of my apartment slowly coming back into focus. The book lay open on the floor, its pages blank, the symbol now etched into my mind, a permanent reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. The figure was gone, but the darkness remained, a cold, hollow void that would never be filled. The tapping had stopped, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it started again, before the asylum called me back once more. I had faced the darkness, but in doing so, I had unleashed something far worse, something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The asylum had claimed me, and though I had survived, I would never be free. The nightmare was far from over, and I knew, deep down, that it would never truly end. The asylum had won. The days that followed were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The asylum had left its mark on me, and no matter how hard I tried to return to normalcy, I could feel its dark influence growing stronger with each passing day. The nightmares persisted, the shadowy figure haunted my every waking moment, and the tapping, always that infernal tapping, continued to echo through my home, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. But there was something else, something far more terrifying that lingered just out of reach, like a shadow on the edge of my vision. I had confronted the darkness within the asylum, but in doing so, I had awakened something far more sinister. It was as if the asylum itself had followed me home, its presence now woven into the very fabric of my life, an inescapable curse that clung to me like a shroud. The tapping, the shifting shadows, the creeping sense of dread, they were all signs that the nightmare was far from over. The asylum had claimed me, and I knew deep down that it would never let me go. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the silence pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket, I realized that I could no longer ignore the truth. The asylum had taken something from me, something I couldn't quite put into words. It was as if a part of me had been left behind in that cursed place, and without it, I was incomplete, hollow. The darkness that had followed me home was not just a figment of my imagination. It was a part of me now, and it was growing stronger. The tapping began again, louder this time, more insistent, as if it was coming from inside my own skull. I tried to block it out, to push it away, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I could feel it pulsing in time with my heartbeat, a relentless rhythm that threatened to drive me mad. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick oppressive quiet that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I knew that something was coming, something far worse than anything I had faced before. The air grew cold, the shadows deepened, and the room around me seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until I could barely breathe. I stood up, my hands trembling, and looked around, trying to find the source of the unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud, but there was nothing. No sign of the shadowy figure, no tapping, no movement at all. The apartment was still, eerily so, as if time itself had stopped. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint flickering light coming from the hallway, just beyond the threshold of my bedroom door. The light was weak, barely illuminating the darkness, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I knew instinctively that whatever was causing that light was not of this world. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was, to not follow that light. But something inside me, perhaps the same dark curiosity that had led me back to the asylum, compelled me to move forward. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, the cold air biting at my skin. The light was coming from the far end of the hall, where the door to my bedroom stood slightly ajar. I could see the faint glow seeping through the crack, and with each step I took, it grew brighter, more intense, until it was almost blinding. The tapping had started up again, but this time it was different, faster, more frantic, like a heartbeat racing out of control. I reached to the door and pushed it open, the light spilling out into the hallway, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The room was bathed in a pale, sickly glow, the source of which was a small, ancient lantern sitting on the floor in the center of the room. The lantern's flame flickered weakly, casting distorted, dancing shadows on the walls, and as I stepped inside, I could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold seeping into my bones. But it wasn't the lantern that held my attention. It was the figure standing beside it. The faceless entity was there, just as it had been in my dreams. Its featureless face turned towards me, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air around it seemed to ripple with a dark energy, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it, a cold, suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming the same symbol that had haunted me for so long, the same symbol that had been etched into the book in the asylum. The figure pointed to the symbol, its movement slow and deliberate, as if urging me to look closer, to understand the significance of what I was seeing. As I stared at the symbol, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The symbol was not just a mark of the asylum. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far darker, something that had been waiting for me all along. The asylum had not just claimed me, it had marked me, chosen me to be its vessel, its conduit to the outside world. And now, the time had come to fulfill that purpose. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, the shadows around it growing darker, more oppressive. I could feel the darkness pressing down on me, suffocating me, as the figure reached out a hand and placed it on the lantern. The flame inside flickered, then flared up, casting the room in a blinding light that seared my eyes. The symbol on the wall began to glow, the lines of the symbol pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me closer, as if the symbol itself was alive, feeding off my fear. The growling sound grew louder, more intense, until it was a deafening roar that filled the room, drowning out everything else. And then, with a final, blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The room around me was gone, replaced by a vast, empty void of darkness. I was floating in the blackness, weightless, alone, the only sound the beating of my own heart, echoing in the emptiness. The figure was gone, the lantern extinguished, but the symbol remained, glowing faintly in the darkness, a reminder of the nightmare that had consumed me. As I floated there, suspended in the void, I realized the truth. The asylum had never been a place. It had always been a state of mind, a manifestation of the darkness within me, a reflection of the fears and doubts that had haunted me for so long. The asylum had chosen me because I was already broken, already tainted by the darkness that now threatened to consume me. The faceless figure had been a guide, leading me deeper into the nightmare, forcing me to confront the darkness within myself. And now, I had reached the end, the final confrontation between light and dark, Between sanity and madness, the symbol glowed brighter, pulsing with a dark energy that filled the void, and I knew that I had a choice to make. I could either embrace the darkness, become one with the asylum, and let it consume me completely, or I could fight back, resist the pull of the void, and find a way to break free. But the darkness was strong, stronger than I had ever imagined, and it whispered to me, promising release, promising peace. It would be so easy to let go, to surrender to the void, to become one with the darkness that had haunted me for so long. But deep down, I knew that if I gave in, I would be lost forever, a prisoner of the asylum, my soul trapped in the void for all eternity. With a final, desperate burst of strength, I reached out towards the symbol, my hand trembling as I touched the glowing lines. The darkness surged around me, trying to pull me back, but I held on, focusing all my energy on the light, the one small spark of hope that remained. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the void shattered. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to me like a shroud. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. The tapping had stopped, the shadows were still, and the faceless figure was gone. So,